long before Iraq was called Iraq, before borders, flags, or modern states. This land was already ancient beyond memory. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity first learned how to settle, to write, to govern, and to remember itself. Cities rose here while the rest of the world still wandered. Laws were carved into stone. Gods were given names, temples, and stories. Power, faith, and ambition intertwined so early that history itself seems to breathe differently on this soil. Yet, Iraq is not merely the cradle of civilization, it is the burdened heir of it. Every empire that followed believed it had discovered this land anew, and every one left scars alongside monuments. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Ottomans, and modern powers all claimed stewardship, each convinced they were the culmination of history rather than another chapter. What endures is not dominance, but continuity, a people forced to live with the weight of beginnings and the violence of endless reinvention. This story is not about a fallen past frozen in ruins. It is about inheritance, how a land that taught humanity to build civilizations has been repeatedly denied the right to define its own future. To understand Iraq is to confront a paradox, how the birthplace of order has known so much disorder, and how a nation so old is still struggling to be allowed to exist on its own terms. From the first cities to the modern age, this is the story of Heir, of Mesopotamia, where history never truly ends, and every present moment argues with the past. Chapter 1: Iraq, the first cities and the birth of power. Long before Iraq was called Iraq, before borders, flags, or nations, it was known by a more dangerous name, Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not merely water the soil, they carved humanity out of mud and memory. Here, power was not inherited from gods alone. It was engineered, measured, written, and enforced. This chapter begins not with kings, but with settlement, the radical decision by humans to stop wandering. Around 10,000 years ago, scattered clans along the riverbanks began to stay. The rivers flooded unpredictably, destroying crops as often as they nourished them. Survival demanded coordination. Coordination demanded rules. Rules demanded authority. From this simple chain of necessity emerged the first cities: Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, your names that still echo like the opening lines of civilization itself. Uruk, in particular, was not just a city, it was a statement. Massive walls enclosed tens of thousands of people, farmers, priests, builders, traders, living under a shared system. For the first time in history, humans accepted a truth that would haunt them forever. Freedom could be exchanged for order. Power in early Mesopotamia was inseparable from the sacred. The temple stood at the city's heart, rising as a ziggurat, part mountain, part staircase to the heavens. Priests claimed to interpret the will of the gods, but what they truly mastered was administration, grain storage, labor assignments, calendars, rituals. These were tools of governance, disguised as worship. From clay tablets, scratched with pictographs, emerged writing, not to tell stories, but to count sheep, barley, labor days. Writing was born as a weapon of control before it became a vehicle for imagination. To write something down was to make it permanent, tanned, therefore enforceable. As cities grew, so did conflict. Water rights sparked wars. Trade routes invited ambition. The peaceful coordination of irrigation slowly transformed into militarized competition. city fought city. Wall rose against wall. And from this crucible emerged a new figure, the king. Early Mesopotamian kings did not rule by blood alone. They ruled by proximity to the divine. Titles like shepherd of the people masked a harsher reality. Kings were war leaders, judges, tax collectors, and executioners. Their legitimacy rested on a dangerous promise obedience in exchange for protection. One name towers above this era like a shadow cast backward through time: Gilgamesh. Part god, part man, king of Uruk-Gilgamesh was remembered not because he ruled, but because he questioned power itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving epic, reveals something unsettling, even at civilization's dawn. Humans understood that strength alone could not defeat death, chaos, or time. Power could build cities, but it could not grant meaning. Yet, while poets wrestled with mortality, rulers pursued permanence through law. The most famous expression of this pursuit was the Code of Hammurabi. Carved into stone and displayed publicly, it declared a radical principle. The king's justice was absolute. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Order through fear, clarity through punishment. It was not. Equality laws differed for nobles, commoners, and slaves, but it was consistency. And consistency was revolutionary. For the first time, power was no longer purely personal. It was systemic. But systems demand maintenance. Bureaucracies expand. Armies grow. Cities strain their resources. The very structures that created stability began to breed fragility. As empires expanded, Dacian, Babylonian, Assyrian, so too did the distance between ruler and ruled. The Assyrians perfected terror as policy. Their reliefs show flayed enemies, impaled prisoners, cities burned to ash. Fear became governance. Yet even the most brutal empire learned the same lesson. Violence secures obedience, but not loyalty. Time after time, Mesopotamian powers collapses not because they were weak, but because they were overextended, brittle, and hated. Still, something endured. Every empire that rose in this land inherited more than territory. It inherited memory, the idea that society could be designed, that authority could be centralized, that law could be written, that history could be recorded. Iraq was not merely the birthplace of cities, it was the birthplace of political imagination. And imagination, once unleashed, cannot be buried. Beneath modern Iraq lie layers upon layers of cities, each built atop the ruins of the last. Power rose, fell, and was rebuilt again and again, like a civilization refusing to forget its own mistakes. The land remembers, even when people try not to. This is where the story of Iraq truly begins, not as a nation, but as a warning that civilization is not a destination, but a tension between order and freedom, faith and force, memory and ambition. And the rivers keep flowing, indifferent as they always have. Chapter 2. Iraq, Gods, Ziggurats, and the Architecture of Belief. If power built the first cities of Mesopotamia, belief is what made them endure. In ancient Iraq, the gods were not distant abstractions. They were everywhere, embedded in stone, encoded in ritual, invoked before every decision that mattered. To live in Mesopotamia was to exist under constant divine observation. In a universe where floods, famine, disease, and victory were never accidents, but messages. The people of Mesopotamia did not ask whether the gods existed. They asked which god was angry and why. Their pantheon was vast and unsettlingly human. Gods quarreled, deceived, loved, punished, and feared one another. Anu ruled the heavens. Enlil commanded storms and authority. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, was clever, subversive, dangerous. Inanna, Ishtar, goddess of love and war, embodied contradiction itself, desire and destruction in the same breath. These were not moral gods. They did not reward virtue. They rewarded obedience. Belief, therefore, was not a matter of faith, it was a matter of survival. At the center of every major city rose a structure unlike anything the world had seen before, the ziggurat. Neither temple nor palace alone, the ziggurat was a political religious machine. Terraced, monumental, dominating the skyline, it functioned as a symbolic bridge between earth and sky. The higher one climbed, the closer one came to the Godzor, so the people were told. In reality, access was restricted. Only priests and elites could ascend its upper levels. The gods were physically elevated, and so was the hierarchy beneath them. Architecture became ideology made visible. The ziggurat did not invite worshippers upward. It reminded them of their place below. Inside the religious system, priests wielded immense power. They interpreted omens, read the stars, examined animal entrails, recorded eclipses, and decided which rituals were required to restore balance when disasters struck. Their authority rested on uncertainty, the belief that chaos was always one divine misstep away. Nothing was random. If crops failed, a ritual had been neglected. If a king lost a battle, a god had withdrawn favor. Responsibility was diffuse, but guilt was everywhere. This worldview produced an extraordinary paradox. Mesopotamians believed humans were created to serve the gods. Yet they also believed the gods were unreliable, capricious, and sometimes cruel. Worship was not love, it was risk management. Even morality was shaped by this logic. Sin was not ethical failure, was procedural error. Say the wrong prayer, perform the ritual incorrectly, disrespect a boundary. Punishment followed not because it was deserved, but because it was inevitable. To protect themselves, Mesopotamians built systems of appeasement, festivals, offerings, processions, chants repeated with obsessive precision. Religion became bureaucracy. Bureaucracy became control, and kings stood at the intersection of both. The ruler was not a god. This distinction mattered deeply, but he was the chief intermediary. His duty was to maintain cosmic order, the fragile balance between divine will and human society. When the king ruled justly, the gods prospered the land. When he failed, catastrophe followed. This belief bound political obedience to cosmic stability. Rebellion was not just treason, it was sacrilege. Yet belief also bred anxiety. Mesopotamian texts are filled with fear of divine abandonment. Prayers beg the gods not for love, but for explanation. Why have you turned away from me? What law have I broken unknowingly? The idea that punishment could arrive without clear cause haunted the culture. Unlike later traditions promising redemption or salvation, Mesopotamian religion offered no escape from fate. Even the afterlife was bleak, a shadowy underworld where all souls, righteous or wicked, wandered in dust and silence. Immortality belonged to the gods alone. This realization cut deep. It shaped the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero's greatest triumph is not conquest, but acceptance. The gods will not grant eternal life. Meaning must be found elsewhere, perhaps in memory, perhaps in legacy, perhaps in the city walls that outlast the builder. Thus belief did not soften power, it hardened it. Cities expanded their temples. Empires adopted and absorbed local gods, rather than erase them, weaving belief into governance. Conquered peoples were not only defeated militarily, their gods were subordinated or relocated. Divine hierarchy, but belief, like power, carried seeds of collapse. As empires grew, so did contradictions. When calamity struck again and again, plague, invasion, drought, people began to question not the gods' existence, but their fairness. If rituals were followed and disaster still came, what then? Faith strained under repetition of failure. New gods rose. Old ones faded. Rituals evolved, yet the structure remained. Fear, appeasement, hierarchy. The architecture of belief proved remarkably adaptably as empires fell. Long after the ziggurats crumbled, their logic survived. That power requires sacred justification. That authority must appear ordained. That architecture can teach obedience without words. Modern Iraq stands atop these ruins, inheritor not only of cities and laws, but of an ancient truth learned early and paid for repeatedly. That belief, once built into stone, does not disappear when the stone collapses. It lingers in memory, in culture, in the uneasy relationship between power and the sacred. And the question remains unresolved, as it did thousands of years ago. Are the gods guardians of order or reflections of human fear? Chapter 3, Iraq, Empires of Iron, Akkad, Assyria, and the machinery of conquest. Civilization in Mesopotamia did not remain confined to city walls for long. Once humans learned how to organize labor, store surplus, and command belief, the next step was inevitable: expansion. Power, when stabilized, seeks movement. And in the land that would become Iraq, movement meant conquest. The first to fully grasp this truth were the Akkadians. Around the 24th century BCE, a ruler named Sargon of Akkad accomplished something unprecedented. He did not merely conquer rival cities, he unified them under a single political identity. Where earlier kings ruled locally, Sargon ruled imperially. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, binding diverse peoples through force, administration, and myth. Sargon understood that conquest alone was insufficient. Empires collapse when they fail to explain themselves. So he crafted a narrative. He was chosen by the goddess Ishtar, raised from obscurity, destined to rule the world. Legitimacy was manufactured as carefully as weapons were forged. The Akkadian innovation lay in centralization. Governors replaced local rulers. Taxes flowed inward. Armies became permanent institutions rather than temporary levies. Warfare shifted from episodic conflict to continuous policy. For the first time, war was not a response, it was a system. Yet, the Akkadian Empire revealed an enduring pattern. The larger the empire grew, the more fragile it became. Droughts weakened agriculture, rebellions multiplied, communication slowed. When the empire finally collapsed, it did not fall to a single enemy, but to overextension and internal fracture. Others learned from its failure. Centuries later, the Assyrians transformed conquest into an art form and a science of terror. Assyria did not hide its brutality, it displayed it. Palace walls were carved with reliefs showing cities burning, captives beheaded, enemies impaled. This was not excess violence, it was policy. Fear reduced the need for prolonged resistance. Reputation became a weapon as powerful as any sword. Assyrian kings perfected logistical warfare. Roads, supply depots, standardized equipment, disciplined infantry, these allowed rapid campaigns across vast distances. Iron weapons replaced bronze, giving Assyrian armies a decisive technological edge. But the true machinery of conquest was psychological. Deportation was systematic. Entire populations were uprooted and resettled across the empire, breaking local identities and preventing organized rebellion. Culture itself became a battlefield. To be conquered by Assyria was not only to lose independence, it was to lose memory. And yet, the Assyrians were not mere destroyers. They were obsessive record keepers. Their capital, at Nineveh, housed one of the ancient world's greatest libraries. Kings like Ashurbanipal collected texts from across the known world, myths, medical treatises, omens, histories. Even as they erased cultures, they preserved fragments of them. Power, once again, proved contradictory. The Assyrian worldview was uncompromising. The king was the chosen instrument of the god Ashur. Expansion was divine duty. Mercy was weakness. Peace existed only when enemies no longer could resist. For centuries, this logic worked. Then it failed. The very terror that kept the empire together ensured that when weakness appeared, enemies multiplied. Babylon revolted. The Medes advanced. Former subjects turned allies into executioners. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. The empire collapsed with shocking speed, leaving behind ruins and stunned silence. From the ashes rose Babylon, not as a novelty, but as a reconfiguration. Babylonian power favored law and culture over raw terror, but it retained the imperial framework inherited from its predecessors. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon dominated the region, rebuilt temples, codified authority, and projected splendor. The Hanging Gardens, whether real or mythic, symbolized a shift, power that sought admiration rather than fear. Yet admiration proved no more durable. Babylon fell, not to rebellion, but to absorption. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia entered the city with minimal resistance. He presented himself not as conqueror, but as liberator, restorer of temples, respecter of gods. It was a new model of empire, built on tolerance rather than annihilation, and it succeeded where others failed temporarily. Across Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon, a single lesson emerges with brutal clarity. Empires are not defeated by outsiders alone. They collapse when the machinery of conquest outpaces the capacity to sustain meaning, loyalty, and order. Iraq's land absorbed these cycles repeatedly. Every empire believed it was final. Every empire was wrong. What remained was not dominance, but infrastructure auditions, laws, administrative logic, military doctrine. Later powers would inherit these tools, often without realizing their origin. The iron of empire rusted, but the idea of empire endured. Modern states still draw from these ancient blueprints: centralized authority, standing armies, controlled narratives, justified violence. Iraq witnessed these mechanisms at their birth and has lived with their consequences ever since. Empires did not simply pass through this land. They were forged here, and each left behind a question that has never been answered convincingly. Can power expand without devouring itself? Chapter 4: IRAQ, Babylon, Law, and the Dream of Order after centuries of conquest, terror, and collapse. Mesopotamia reached a moment of pause. The land was exhausted by empires that ruled through fear. Into this silence rose Babylon, not merely as a city, but as an idea, that power might endure not through constant violence, but through order. Babylon stood on the same soil soaked with blood and ambition, yet it offered a different promise. Where Assyria ruled by terror, Babylon claimed to rule by law. Where iron had spoken, stone would now speak instead. At the heart of this vision stood Hammurabi. Hammurabi did not invent laws. Rules had governed cities long before him. What he did that was revolutionary was to fix law in public space. His code, nearly 300 statutes carved into a towering stone stele, was placed where all could see it. The message was unmistakable. Justice was no longer hidden in priestly interpretation or royal whim. It was written, permanent, and unavoidable, or so it appeared. The Code of Hammurabi is often remembered for its severity, for eye, tooth for tooth. Yet its deeper significance lies elsewhere. It reveals a society obsessed with predictability. In a world where gods were capricious and disasters arbitrary, law offered an illusion of stability. If people knew the rules, they believed they could avoid chaos. But Babylonian law was not equal. Penalties varied sharply, depending on status. The life of a noble weighed more than that of a commoner. A slave's body was property. Order existed, but it was hierarchical order. Justice reinforced power rather than restraining it. Still, the idea mattered. For the first time, authority justified itself not only by divine favor or military dominance, but by procedure. The king presented himself as shepherd, judge, and protector. Hammurabi claimed his laws were given by the god Shamash, god of justice, but their execution was entirely human. Law became the bridge between heaven and earth. Babylon itself reflected this philosophy. Its walls were massive, yet symbolic as much as defensive. Its gates, most famously the Ishtar Gate, were adorned with glazed bricks, lions, dragons, and bulls. Power was not merely enforced, it was displayed. The city did not want to terrify outsiders, alone it wanted to impress them. Inside Babylon, administration flourished. Contracts were written, debts recorded, marriages registered, commerce regulated. Civilization became paperwork. Writing, once used to count grain, now structured society itself. Yet beneath this growing order lay a familiar tension. The dream of law assumes compliance. But humans do not obey laws because they exist. They obey when enforcement is consistent and authority is trusted. Babylon struggled with both. Corruption crept into administration. Judges could be bribed. Officials exploited ambiguity. Law hardened into formality, while justice thinned into ritual. The code stood tall in stone, but daily life remained messy, unequal, and often cruel. Religion remained deeply intertwined with law. Crimes were not just offenses against people. They were offenses against cosmic balance. Punishment was therefore not merely corrective, it was ritual purification. Executions, fines, mutilations restored order, not only socially, but metaphysically. This fusion made dissent dangerous. To challenge law was to challenge the gods. Reform became sacrilege. Stability turned rigid. Yet Babylon's greatest vulnerability was not internal decay, was illusion. The city believed order could preserve power indefinitely. It believed walls, laws, and rituals could outlast ambition. But order without adaptability becomes fragility. When new powers emerged beyond Mesopotamia, most notably the Persians' Babylon discovered that law does not stop armies, and tradition does not prevent absorption. In 539 BCE, when Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, the city barely resisted. The population, weary of rigid authority, saw the conqueror as an alternative rather than an enemy. Babylon did not fall in flames, it dissolved. Its laws were admired, but superseded. Its gods were respected, but subordinated. Its administrative systems were absorbed into a larger imperial framework. Order survived, but Babylonian sovereignty did not. Still, its legacy proved indestructible. Every later civilization that claimed to rule by Loroman, Islamic modern echoed Babylon's experiment. The idea that authority must be codified, visible, and justified through written rules began here. Even the concept of constitutional order traces its ancestry to these stone inscriptions. Yet Babylon also left behind a warning. Law can create stability, but it cannot create loyalty. It can regulate behavior, but it cannot generate meaning. Without flexibility, compassion, and shared belief, order becomes a cage rather than a foundation. Iraq, standing atop Babylon's ruins, inherited both the dream and the burden of this realization, that civilization's greatest ambition is not conquest but permanence, and that permanence, pursued too rigidly, becomes the seed of collapse. The dream of order did not die in Babylon. It simply moved forward and changed, untested and still unresolved. Chapter 5: IRAQ, Persia, Tolerance, and the Art of Ruling Diversity. When Babylon fell, it did not fall screaming. In 539 BCE, the gates opened not under fire, but under fatigue. The people of Mesopotamia had seen too many empires claim eternity. So when Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon, he did something no conqueror before him had fully understood. He did not try to erase what existed. Instead, he absorbed it. This moment marked a profound shift in the logic of power. Iraq-ancient Mesopotamia was no longer the center of empire, but it became something equally important, the testing ground for a new imperial philosophy. The Persians ruled differently. Cyrus did not present himself as a destroyer. He restored temples. He respected local gods. He allowed deported peoples to return home. His proclamations spoke not of domination, but of balance. Where Assyria ruled through terror and Babylon through rigid order, Persia experimented with tolerance as strategy. This was not compassion, it was intelligence. The Persian Empire was vast, far larger than anything Mesopotamia had produced. Diversity was not a weakness to be crushed, it was a reality to be managed. Languages, religions, customs, and laws varied wildly across the empire. Attempting uniformity would have guaranteed rebellion. So the Persians ruled through delegation. Satraps governed provinces. Local elites retained authority. Existing legal systems were preserved. Tribute flowed upward, but daily life remained familiar. Iraq's ancient cities Babylon, Nippur continued to function as administrative and cultural centers. Power became less visible, but more resilient. The Persians also mastered infrastructure. Roads connected continents. Couriers carried messages across thousands of kilometers. A standardized system of taxation fed the imperial core without constant warfare. Control was exercised not only by soldiers, but by systems. For Iraq, this era brought relative stability. The land that had birthed empires now served one. Its scholars, scribes, engineers, and priests were integrated into a broader world. Mesopotamian knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, law circulated far beyond the rivers that created it. Yet tolerance carried its own tension. When power allows difference, it must also accept distance. Loyalty becomes transactional. Obedience depends on benefit, not belief. The Persian king was respected, but rarely loved. Authority rested on performance rather than identity. This made the empire strong but also vulnerable to disruption. When Alexander of Macedon invaded in the 4th century BCE, he encountered little unified resistance in Mesopotamia. Cities opened their gates again, calculating that survival mattered more than allegiance. Babylon welcomed Alexander as it had welcomed Cyrus. Iraq had learned a brutal lesson across centuries. Empires come and go, the land remains. Alexander dreamed of fusion, Greek and Persian, East and West. Babylon was to be his imperial capital. He respected its antiquity, walked its streets, consulted its priests, and then, abruptly, he died there. Once again, Iraq witnessed ambition collapse into dust. What followed was fragmentation. Successor kingdoms fought, cultures mixed unevenly. Greek ideas blended with Mesopotamian traditions, creating hybrids that satisfied no one completely. Tolerance gave way to uncertainty, stability fractured, yet the Persian model left an enduring imprint. The idea that power could rule diversity without erasing it became a template. Later empires, the Romans, the caliphates, even modern states would struggle with the same question Persia confronted early. How do you govern difference without destroying unity? Iraq stood at the center of that question. It had known terror, law, and tolerance. It had been conquered violently and gently. It had learned that no method was permanent. Every system that promised balance eventually tilted. Still, something subtle changed under Persian rule. Power was no longer assumed to be absolute. It became negotiated. Authority depended on cooperation as much as force. And once people learn that rulers need them as much as they need rulers, obedience is never quite the same again. Iraq carried this awareness forward, quietly, dangerously, because tolerance can delay collapse, but it cannot prevent ambition. And diversity can be governed, but never fully controlled. The art of ruling difference was learned here. So were its limits. Chapter 6: Iraq, Baghdad, and the invention of a global mind. Empires had ruled Iraq before through force, law, or tolerance. But none had yet attempted something more audacious: to rule through knowledge. When the Abbasid Caliphate founded Baghdad in the 8th century CE, it was not meant to be merely a capital. It was conceived as an experimental idea rendered in stone and ink, a city designed not just to govern territory, but to organize the human mind. Baghdad rose where empires had already fallen, deliberately placed near the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. This was not coincidence. The Abbasids understood something their predecessors rarely admitted. Legitimacy is strongest when it claims inheritance. Baghdad did not reject the past, it absorbed it. The city's circular design symbolized cosmic order. At its center stood the caliph, not as a god, but as a steward of divine law. Around him spread administration, markets, mosques, schools, libraries. Power radiated outward, but knowledge flowed inward. And then something unprecedented happened. Instead of destroying foreign ideas, Baghdad invited them. Greek philosophy, Persian statecraft, Indian mathematics, Chinese technology, all were translated, debated, refined. The House of Wisdom became the intellectual heart of the known world. Scholars were paid not to worship, but to question. Texts were not preserved as relics, but dissected as tools. For the first time in history, a civilization pursued systematic global synthesis. Baghdad's scholars did not merely copy Aristotle, they challenged him. They did not merely calculate, they invented algebra. They did not merely observe stars, they corrected ancient astronomy. Medicine became clinical. Philosophy became analytical. Geography became empirical. Knowledge was no longer regional, it was portable. This intellectual openness reshaped power itself. Authority no longer relied solely on ancestry or conquest. It required competence. Caliphs depended on bureaucrats, judges, scientists, engineers. The state functioned because minds were trained, not because swords were raised. Iraq became the axis of a global network, trade routes from China to Europe, ideas from Athens to Delhi, manuscripts from Alexandria, reborn in Arabic. Baghdad was not simply a city of Islam, it was a city of translation. Yet this brilliance carried a hidden tension. Knowledge destabilizes hierarchy. As philosophy flourished, theology fractured. Rationalists argued with literalists. Jurists disagreed on law. Thinkers questioned whether reason could interpret revelation or even correct it. The very openness that empowered Baghdad also eroded certainty. Unity weakened. The Abbasid Caliph, once an unchallenged authority, became increasingly symbolic. Real power shifted to military elites, provincial governors, and rival dynasties. Baghdad remained intellectually luminous but politically fragile. Then came the shock that history still has not fully absorbed. In 1258, the Mongols arrived. Hulagu Khan's armies did not negotiate with ideas. They did not respect libraries. They did not distinguish between scholar and soldier. Baghdad fell with catastrophic finality. The House of Wisdom burned. Manuscripts were thrown into the Tigris until the river ran dark with ink. A civilization built on memory was systematically erased. The physical destruction was total, but the deeper tragedy lay elsewhere. The global mind Baghdad had assembled was scattered. Scholars fled. Networks collapsed. Patronage vanished. Knowledge survived, but without its center. Iraq did not recover its intellectual primacy, and yet Baghdad's legacy outlived its walls. Europe's Renaissance would later draw heavily from texts translated and preserved in Arabic. Algebra, optics, medicine, philosophy, ideas, born or reborn in Baghdad, reshaped the modern world. Iraq had already given humanity cities law, empire, tolerance. Now it had given something more elusive, method. The idea that knowledge progresses through comparison, debate, correction, that truth is refined, not revealed once and forever. That civilization advances when minds connect across borders. This was Baghdad's quiet revolution. But history is unforgiving to civilizations that depend on openness without protection. Knowledge requires stability. Stability requires power. When the balance breaks, brilliance becomes vulnerability. Iraq learned this lesson painfully. The land that invented civilization also learned that civilization is fragile not because humans are ignorant, but because they are divided. Ideas can unify humanity, but they can also threaten those who profit from certainty. Baghdad's fall marked a turning point. After it, Iraq would be ruled many times again, but rarely would it lead the world's imagination. The center had shifted. Memory remained, but momentum was gone. Still, the question Baghdad raised never disappeared. Can a civilization be built on knowledge alone? Or must power always silence thought to survive? The ruins by the Tigris offer no answer, only a warning. Chapter 7. Iraq. Invasions, fragmentation, and the long decline. When Baghdad burned in 1258, it was not only a city that fell, it was continuity. The Mongol invasion did more than destroy buildings and kill inhabitants. It severed the delicate chain that had linked Iraq's past to its present institutions: patronage, scholarly networks, administrative memory. For the first time since the dawn of civilization, Mesopotamia was no longer a place where systems accumulated. It became a place where systems were interrupted. The shock was profound. The Abbasid Caliphate, already weakened, ceased to exist as a political force. What followed was not a clean transition to a new order, but a prolonged fragmentation. Power splintered among warlords, regional dynasties, and foreign rulers. Iraq ceased to be a center and became a corridor land, passed through, exploited, and contested. The Mongols themselves did not stay unified for long. Their empire fractured, and Iraq was absorbed into the Ilk. Though later Mongol rulers converted to Islam and attempted reconstruction, the damage had already reshaped the land. Irrigation systems, some dating back millennia, were neglected or destroyed. Agricultural productivity collapsed. Cities shrank. Knowledge dispersed. The rivers still flowed, but the systems that once controlled them did not. Into this vacuum stepped successive powers: Timurids, Turkmen, confederations, Safavids, and Ottomans. Each ruled Iraq, briefly or partially. None rebuilt it fully. Governance was reactive, extractive, and militarized. Stability was temporary. Insecurity permanent. The Ottomans, who eventually held Iraq for centuries, governed it as a periphery rather than a heartland. Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul were administered separately, often competing with one another. Tribal autonomy expanded. Local loyalties outweighed imperial identity. The state existed, but weakly. This period produced a different Iraq, where earlier civilizations emphasized centralized authority and written law. Post-Mongol Iraq relied increasingly on custom, tribe, and sect. In the absence of reliable institutions, people turned to what endured: kinship, religion, local power brokers. Fragmentation was no longer an exception, it became the norm. Foreign invasions continued to reinforce this pattern. Safavid-Ottoman wars turned Iraq into a front line between empires, divided not only by territory, but by sectarian identity. Sunni and Shia divisions hardened under imperial competition. What had once been theological diversity became political boundary. Iraq absorbed these tensions, quietly but permanently. Economic decline deepened the problem. Trade routes shifted away from Mesopotamia. Maritime commerce favored new centers. Iraq's ancient advantages, rivers lost strategic primacy. Without wealth, cities decayed. Without cities, intellectual life withered. And yet, decline did not mean disappearance. Iraq remained inhabited, contested, and significant precisely because of its history. Every empire understood its symbolic weight. To rule Iraq was to claim inheritance of civilization itself, even if one could not revive it. This symbolic value invited interference. By the 19th century, European powers entered the scene. Britain, concerned with routes to India and oil interests, began reshaping Iraq's future long before Iraq existed as a nation. Old Ottoman structures were weakened. New boundaries were imagined. Decisions were made far from the land they would affect. Once again, Iraq's fate was being decided elsewhere. What made this long decline particularly devastating was not violence alone, but discontinuity. Iraq did not decline because its people forgot how to build. It declined because every generation was forced to adapt to a new ruler, a new system, a new set of demands. Memory survived, but momentum did not. Civilization requires time to compound. Iraq was denied that time. By the eve of the modern era, the land that had invented cities had become administratively fractured, economically marginalized, and politically vulnerable. Its people were resilient, but its structures were brittle. This long decline created a dangerous illusion, one that outsiders would later believe and insiders would come to resent. That Iraq was a land defined by chaos rather than creation. But this illusion ignores a crucial truth. Decline is not the absence of history. It is the accumulation of unresolved history. Every invasion layered trauma atop memory. Every fragmentation deepened mistrust. Every failed reconstruction taught people not to rely on systems that might vanish tomorrow. Survival became local. Loyalty became conditional. Hope became cautious. Iraq did not forget how to build civilizations. It learned how quickly they could be taken away. By the time modern powers arrived with promises of reform, borders, and nationhood, they encountered a society shaped less by ignorance than by experience of betrayal, interruption, and imposed order. The long decline was not a straight line downward. It was a stala civilization paused under pressure, waiting for a future that never quite arrived. And so Iraq entered the modern age carrying a unique burden, the memory of greatness without the structures to protect it, the knowledge of systems without the power to enforce them, and a land whose past was heavier than its present. The question was no longer how civilizations are built. Iraq had answered that thousands of years ago. The question now was darker and far more difficult. How do you rebuild a civilization that has been interrupted too many times to trust permanence itself? Chapter 8, IRAQ, Colonial Borders and the Invention of a Nation. Modern Iraq was not born, it was assembled. When the First World War ended, the Ottoman Empire, ready hollowed by centuries of decline, collapsed entirely. Into the vacuum stepped European powers, who did not see Mesopotamia as a civilization with memory, but as a problem to be organized. Britain and France arrived with maps, treaties, and assumptions forged far from the Tigris and Euphrates. What they created was not inevitable, it was designed. The borders of Iraq were drawn in offices, not deserts. Provinces that had long functioned separately, Basra, Baghdad, Mosul, were fused into a single political entity. The logic was strategic, not social. Oil fields, trade routes, imperial convenience. Diversity was not negotiated, it was contained. For the first time in history, the land that had invented political systems was forced into one not of its own making. The British Mandate framed itself as guidance toward self-rule. In practice, it was control with new vocabulary. Administrators relied on air power to suppress revolts. Local leaders were selected for compliance, not legitimacy. Institutions were created quickly, artificially, and unevenly. Iraq was given a state, before it was allowed to become a nation. This mismatch proved fatal. To govern Iraq, Britain installed Faisal I, a Hashemite prince with no deep roots in Mesopotamia. He was intelligent, pragmatic, and aware of the impossible position he occupied. He ruled a country whose people had not consented to its borders, whose identities were layered tribal, religious, regional land, whose experience with centralized authority was defined by trauma. The state existed. Belief in the state did not. Colonial administration attempted to impose unity through bureaucracy, military force, and selective alliances. Sunni Arab elites were favored for governance, creating structural imbalance. Shia communities and Kurds were marginalized or treated as security problems rather than partners. What had once been diversity managed through imperial tolerance became diversity contained through coercion. Resistance emerged almost immediately. The 1920 Iraqi revolt was not nationalist in the modern sense, it was civilizational. Tribes, clerics, urban notables rose together, rejecting foreign rule. Britain suppressed the uprising brutally, but it learned a crucial lesson. Iraq could not be ruled cheaply or gently. From that moment forward, Iraqi politics developed under pressure. National identity was encouraged rhetorically, but undermined structurally. Elections existed, but power remained filtered. Institutions functioned, but loyalty was thin. The state demanded obedience before it earned trust. Education systems promoted national history. Yet that history skipped over uncomfortable truths: artificial borders, imposed monarchy, selective inclusion. The past was curated, memory was managed, silence became policy, and beneath this fragile surface, old patterns resurfaced. Tribal networks reasserted themselves where state services failed. Religious authority filled moral vacuums. Regional loyalties persisted. Iraq was unified on paper, but plural in practice. The invention of the nation-state did not erase ancient realities, it collided with them. Oil intensified everything. As petroleum became central to Iraq's economy, the state gained resources without needing popular consent. Wealth flowed upward. Accountability weakened. Power centralized. The same mechanisms that had once destabilized ancient empires returned under modern banners. Infrastructure improved. Inequality deepened. By mid-century, frustration boiled over. Coups replaced kings. The monarchy fell in 1958, ending colonial architecture but not its legacy. Each new regime promised authenticity, unity, and renewal. Each inherited the same contradictions: forced borders, divided society, militarized politics. Nationalism became louder and harsher. The idea of Iraq as a single, indivisible identity was enforced rather than cultivated. Dissent was labeled treason. Difference became threat. The state hardened in response to its own insecurity. Iraq had entered the modern world with one fundamental disadvantage. It was asked to believe in a nation before it had the chance to negotiate what that nation meant. Colonial borders did not cause Iraq's divisions, but they froze them into permanent tension. They turned historical plurality into political friction. They transformed identity into a battlefield. Yet even this imposed nation was not empty. Iraqis filled it with language, culture, resistance, and adaptation. They argued over what Iraq wasn't, what it should be. The struggle itself became part of national identity. Survival required flexibility. Loyalty became conditional. Memory remained sharp. The tragedy was not that Iraq was invented. All nations are, in some sense. The tragedy was that Iraq was invented without patience, without consent, and without space for its own long history to shape the outcome. A civilization that once built cities, slowly, deliberately, layer by layer, was suddenly told to become a modern state overnight, and the consequences would echo violently in the decades to come. Because when a nation is rushed into existence, it spends the rest of its life trying to prove that it deserves to exist at all. Chapter 9:IRAQ Dictatorship, War, and the Price of Unity. When modern Iraq failed to grow organically, it compensated by growing forcefully. By the mid-20th century, the experiment of monarchy, managed pluralism, and fragile institutions had collapsed under its own contradictions. What replaced it was not chaos, but something far more deliberate: authoritarian unity. If Iraq could not agree on what it was, then power would decide for it. The logic was simple and catastrophic. A divided society, leaders concluded, required a strong hand. Coups became the language of politics. Between 1958 and 1968, Iraq experienced rapid regime changes, each promising stability and authenticity, each more suspicious of dissent than the last. Ideology hardened. The military became arbiter of legitimacy. Politics turned inward, paranoid, absolutist. Out of this environment emerged the Ba'ath Party, a movement that fused Arab nationalism, socialism, and centralized control. Its promise was seductive: transcend sect, tribe, and region through a single, unified Arab identity. Iraq would no longer be a mosaic, it would be a monolith. But monoliths require pressure to hold. When Saddam Hussein formally assumed power in 1979, he inherited a state already conditioned to obedience. He perfected it. Surveillance expanded. Opposition was eliminated systematically. Fear was normalized as governance. The state did not merely rule Iraq, it occupied it. Unity became compulsory. Oil wealth funded massive expansion of infrastructure, education, and military power. For a moment, the system appeared to work. Living standards rose. The state projected confidence. Iraq positioned itself as a regional leader, heir to ancient greatness and modern ambition. But authoritarian unity has a hidden cost. It cannot tolerate uncertainty. In 1980, that cost became visible in blood. The Iran-Iraq War erupted, not from inevitability, but from calculation, fear of revolutionary contagion, desire for regional dominance, belief in decisive force. What followed was 8 years of industrialized slaughter: trenches, chemical weapons, child soldiers, mass graves. The war consumed a generation. Iraq framed the conflict as defense of Arab identity and national survival. Dissent was treason. Sacrifice was mandatory. Unity was enforced through shared suffering. The state demanded loyalty, not by persuasion, but by proximity to death. By 1988, Iraq emerged, exhausted, indebted, traumatized, and militarized, beyond reversal. The regime had learned a dangerous lesson: war sustains authoritarian unity. In 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait. The decision was reckless, but internally logical. External conquest redirected internal pressure. National pride masked economic collapse. Once again, Iraq was mobilized around confrontation. This time, the response was overwhelming. The Gulf War shattered Iraq's military infrastructure in weeks. Sanctions followed, lasting over a decade. The state survived, but society fractured. Middle classes collapsed. Institutions hollowed out. Survival replaced citizenship as the primary concern. Unity remained but only at the surface. The regime tightened control, but its ideological promise evaporated. Nationalism rang hollow amid poverty. Fear endured, but belief did not. Iraq entered the 1990s as a nation suspended between collapse and stagnation, too broken to rebel fully, too controlled to reform. The price of enforced unity was social disintegration. Sectarian and ethnic identities, long suppressed, retreated underground rather than disappearing. Trust eroded. Public life became performative. Loyalty was expressed, not felt. The state spoke loudly, society whispered, and yet the regime endured. Why? Because Iraq, as modern history had taught its people a painful truth. Sudden collapse often brings worse violence than prolonged oppression. Memory restrained rebellion. Survival favored caution. The dictatorship fed on this calculation. But authoritarian systems do not age gracefully. By the early 2000s, Iraq was brittle. Power was centralized, but legitimacy was absent. Institutions existed, but only as extensions of the leader. When that leader was removed, nothing stood ready to replace him. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The regime fell quickly. The state fell with it. What followed was not liberation, but disassembly. The army was dissolved, bureaucracy dismantled, authority vanished overnight. The unity enforced through decades of fear evaporated instantly, and what remained were identities stripped of mediation. The price of unity was now paid in reverse. Civil war, insurgency, foreign interference, sectarian violence, these were not ancient hatreds resurfacing, but modern consequences of a system that had suppressed difference without reconciling it. Iraq did not explode because it was diverse. It exploded because diversity had never been allowed to negotiate power openly. Dictatorship had postponed fragmentation, not prevented it. And war repeated, normalized, glorified, had taught every faction that violence worked. Iraq entered the 21st century carrying the full weight of its contradictions. A civilization that invented governance, ruled without consent. A nation built for unity, fractured by enforcement. A people hardened by survival, exhausted by history. The question that remained was no longer ideological or military. It was existential. If unity imposed from above leads to tyranny, and unity imposed from outside leads to collapse, what kind of unity, if any, can Iraq choose for itself? The answer would define everything that followed. Chapter 10, Iraq, Collapse, Occupation, and the struggle to rebuild meaning. When Baghdad fell in 2003, it did not resemble earlier conquests. There were no new laws carved in stone, no grand ideology declared eternal. No clear successor claiming legitimacy. What collapsed was not only a regime, but the idea of continuity itself. The removal of Saddam Hussein ended dictatorship, but it also ended the state as Iraq had known it. Ministries emptied overnight, the army dissolved, police vanished, borders became porous, power did not transfer, it evaporated. For ordinary Iraqis, the moment was not liberation or defeat, it was disorientation. For decades, the state, brutal as it was, had provided structure, jobs, rations, rules, fear. Suddenly, none of it existed. Looting swept through cities, not because Iraqis were lawless, but because law itself had disappeared. Museums burned, hospitals emptied. Archives were destroyed. Memory was assaulted alongside order. Occupation filled the vacuum but without understanding what it had replaced. The foreign powers that entered Iraq believed they were dismantling tyranny to reveal democracy beneath it. Instead, they uncovered something far more fragile. A society whose institutions had been fused to authoritarianism for so long that removing one destroyed the other. Debothification, intended to cleanse the state, instead decapitated it. Experienced administrators were purged. Security forces were dismissed. Millions were suddenly unemployed, armed, and humiliated. The decision was irreversibly and catastrophic. Power re-emerged where it always does, in collapse, in militias, sects, tribes, and foreign patrons. Elections were held, constitutions written, governments formed. On paper, Iraq was reborn as a democracy. In reality, the state lacked monopoly over violence, trust, or narrative. Politics became a contest not over policy, but over identity and survival. Sunni, Shia, Kurdish labels hardened into political currencies. What had been suppressed under dictatorship now erupted without mediation. Old grievances resurfaced, magnified by occupation and fear. Violence became communal. Bombings became routine. Civil war was no longer theoretical, it was lived. Iraq was not reliving ancient hatreds, it was paying the deferred cost of enforced unity. Occupation compounded the damage. Foreign forces operated with overwhelming power, but limited legitimacy. Every mistake, raids, detentions, civilian death, deepened resentment. Insurgency fed on humiliation. Militias claimed protection. External actors intervened, turning Iraq into a battlefield for regional rivalry, meaning fractured. What did Iraq represent now? A failed state, a battlefield, a victim, a warning. For many Iraqis, identity narrowed. When the state cannot protect, people retreat to what can. Community replaces citizenship. Loyalty becomes local. Trust becomes selective. The nation exists but weakly, and yet Iraq did not disappear. Despite relentless violence, people adapted. Markets reopened amid ruins. Universities functioned intermittently. Writers, artists, clerics, activists argued over Iraq's future, even as it burned. The impulse to rebuild physical and moral never vanished. But rebuilding meaning proved harder than rebuilding roads. Democracy without shared trust became transactional. Elections rewarded mobilization, not reconciliation. Corruption flourished. Institutions existed, but credibility did not. Every faction feared exclusion more than it desired cooperation. The state survived, but hollowed. Then came another rupture. In 2014, the so-called Islamic State swept across large parts of Iraq. Its rise was not a mystery. It fed on state failure, sectarian marginalization, and unresolved trauma. It promised clarity where ambiguity reigned, order where chaos ruled, identity where meaning had collapsed. Its violence was extreme, but its appeal was rooted in absence. Iraq fought back. Militias, security forces, international coalitions pushed ISIS out at immense cost. Cities like Mosul were liberated and devastated. Victory came, but scars remained. Millions displaced. Infrastructure ruined. Trust further eroded. By the late 2010s, Iraq stood again at a crossroads. No longer under dictatorship, no longer under full occupation, no longer at total war, and yet not whole. Protests erupted, demanding dignity, accountability, and an end to corruption. Young Iraqis born into war-ejected sectarian politics. They spoke not of ancient divisions, but of stolen futures. Their demands were simple and radical: a state that serves, not dominates. The response was mixed: some reforms, some repression. The familiar pattern of partial change. Iraq was once again trying to do something it had rarely been allowed to do: rebuild meaning from within, not imposed by empire, not enforced by fear, not dictated by ideology. But this is the hardest form of reconstruction. Meaning cannot be legislated. Trust cannot be rushed. History cannot be erased. Iraq carries more memory than most lands of invention, conquest, collapse, interruption. Each era promised finality. None delivered it. The struggle now is not for dominance or unity at any cost, but for coexistence with honesty. The collapse taught Iraq what happens when systems are destroyed overnight. The occupation taught it what happens when change lacks legitimacy. The wars taught it the price of unresolved identity. What remains is a fragile opportunity, not to return to ancient greatness, not to imitate foreign models, but to answer a question older than the nation itself. Can a civilization that invented power learn how to limit it? Can a society shaped by interruption learn patience? Can Iraq rebuild not just institutions, but belief in shared future? The answer has not yet been written. Chapter 11, Iraq. Between memory, youth, and an unfinished future, Iraq today exists in a suspended state, neither collapsed nor consolidated, neither healed nor wholly broken. It is a country living between memories it cannot escape, and a future it has not yet defined. For older generations, Iraq is remembered through loss layered upon loss. The monarchy that promised stability but fell to revolution. The republic that promised justice but hardened into tyranny. The wars that promised glory and delivered graves. The sanctions that hollowed daily life. The invasion that promised freedom and delivered fragmentation. Memory in Iraq is not abstract. It is embodied in ruined neighborhoods, missing relatives, interrupted educations, and careers that never began. For younger Iraqis, memory is inherited rather than lived. Most were born after 2003. They do not remember Saddam as a ruler, only as a story. They do not recall a strong state only, a weak one. Their normal is checkpoints, blackouts, unemployment, and politics that feel distant and corrupt. And yet, this generation is the most consequential Iraq has produced in decades. They are less ideologically rigid, less sectarian by instinct, more connected to the world than any generation before them. Social media did what the state never could. It created a shared public space across sectarian lines. In protest squares from Baghdad to Basra, young Iraqis spoke a new language, not of Shia or Sunni, not of tribe or party, but of dignity, citizenship, and stolen opportunity. The protests of 2019 were not spontaneous outbursts. They were the delayed eruption of a generation that had endured instability without voice. Their message was unmistakable. The old narratives no longer worked. They rejected foreign domination, whether Western or regional. They rejected sectarian quotas. They rejected leaders who invoked history as an excuse for failure. What they demanded was deceptively simple: a state that functions. But Iraq's problem is not only political, it is temporal. The country is trapped between too much past and too little future. History weighs heavily. Mesopotamia is celebrated, but also weaponized. Every group can point to ancient legitimacy. Every faction can claim victimhood. Memory becomes a tool, not for understanding, but for leverage. At the same time, the future feels abstract. Economic opportunity is scarce. Corruption absorbs potential. Education exists, but pathways do not. Talented young Iraqis often see emigration not as ambition, but as survival. This creates a paradox. The generation most capable of rebuilding Iraq is also the most likely to leave it. Institutions remain fragile. The state still struggles to assert authority over armed groups. Elections occur, but participation declines. Cynicism spreads faster than reform. Many Iraqis believe change is possible, but not through existing structures, and yet collapse has not returned. This matters. Iraq's resilience is quiet, uncelebrated, and often misunderstood. It lies not in grand victories, but in endurance. Cities destroyed by ISIS were rebuilt piece by piece. Families displaced returned. Cultural life, though constrained, persists. Literature, music, and satire continue to interrogate power when politics cannot. Iraq is not static. It is contested terrain, internally and externally. Regional powers compete for influence. Global actors engage selectively. Iraq is pulled between alliances, yet increasingly wary of being used. Its leaders walk a narrow line between sovereignty and dependency. The question is no longer whether Iraq will survive, has proven that it can. The question is what form that survival will take. Will memory remain a prison, endlessly rehearsed, or can it become a lesson, selectively carried forward? Will youth energy be absorbed into reform, more drained into exile and apathy? Will identity remain defensive or evolve into something civic? These are not questions with immediate answers. State building, after prolonged trauma, is not linear. It requires patience in a society trained by crisis to expect rupture. It requires compromise in a political culture shaped by zero-sum survival. It requires time, and Iraq has rarely been granted time. But something has shifted. For the first time in generations, the dominant question is not who rules Iraq, but what is Iraq for? Is it merely a battlefield for others' ambitions, a container for ancient memories, a state that manages division rather than resolving it? Or can it become a place where history informs but does not suffocate, where youth participate, not flee, where power is restrained rather than feared? Iraq's future will not resemble its past empires, nor will it cleanly replicate foreign models. If it succeeds, it will do so imperfectly, slowly, and unevenly through negotiated coexistence rather than imposed unity. The unfinished future of Iraq is not a failure. It is an opening, an opportunity that remains fragile, reversible, and contested, but real. A civilization that once taught the world how to write laws is now relearning how to live with them. A society shaped by interruption is learning continuity. A nation burdened by memory is asking what it is willing to remember and what it must finally let go. The story is not complete because Iraq is no longer fighting only to exist. It is fighting to decide what it wants to become. Meaning is the shared answer to a simple but dangerous question. Why does this society exist together at all? For thousands of years, Mesopotamia answered that question through order, cosmic, legal, and social. The earliest laws did not merely regulate behavior. They asserted that the world was intelligible, that chaos could be named, bounded, judged. Even conquest preserved this idea. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Abbasids, all different, often brutal, but united by the assumption that rule had purpose, hierarchy had logic, and power carried obligation. Modern Iraq shattered that continuity. Colonial borders severed history from governance. Dictatorship reduced meaning to obedience. War transformed survival into the only virtue. Occupation fragmented authority itself. What followed was not just state collapse, but semantic collapse, a breakdown in shared narratives about legitimacy, justice, and belonging. The youth understand this intuitively. Their protests were not ideological manifestos. They were existential refusals. Refusals to inherit a life defined solely by recovery from catastrophe. They did not demand utopia. They demanded significance. The state has not yet answered them. Institutions lag behind consciousness. Political elites remain shaped by older logics of patronage, fear, and external alignment. Reform moves incrementally, often invisibly. Disillusionment is real. They renew through reorientation. Iraq's potential renewal will not resemble its ancient past, nor will it follow Western linear narratives of progress. It will likely be hybrid, uneven, contradictory. It may involve decentralization without disintegration, plural identity without enforced uniformity, memory acknowledged without being weaponized. Meaning, in this context, does not require consensus on everything. It requires agreement on limits: what violence is unacceptable, what corruption is intolerable, what future must remain open. The most profound shift in Iraq today is subtle. Fewer people believe salvation will come from a single ruler, ideology, or foreign power. This skepticism is painful but necessary. It is the soil in which mature meaning grows. Civilization after rupture is humbler. It speaks less of destiny and more of responsibility, less of glory and more of continuity, less of conquest and more of coexistence. Iraq may never again dominate the world's imagination as the cradle of civilization, but it may offer something rarer, a demonstration that civilizations do not die when they fall only, when they stop asking who they are for. The Euphrates still flows, languages still adapt, generations still argue with their inheritance. Meaning, it turns out, is not preserved by monuments alone. It is preserved by the refusal to let history's weight become an excuse for moral resignation. Iraq stands at that refusal, not healed, not whole, but still choosing again and again to exist as more than ruins. That choice, repeated imperfectly over time, is what civilizations are ultimately made of.